The 18th of March, 1915 was already an intensely hot day, as if it were summer, when it seemed there was no hiding from the sun. Inhabitants of the small town of Santiago Tiexia were glad when an unexpected but pleasantly cool breeze blew outside. Wenceslao Moguel Herrera didn't notice this, however, while he stood in a cold sweat with buckling knees. The young 25-year-old man felt his arms, which were bound tightly by rope, go numb. Opposite Moguel, a firing squad had formed a line, 8 soldiers. An officer ordered them to fire their weapons. Wenceslao looked at his sides, the deserted outskirts of the town, piles of rubbish, and right beside him, a shallow hole where his friends lay, killed just minutes ago. There wasn't the slightest chance of escape. Moguel, who over the last few years had seen quite a bit of death and violence, could not come to terms with the fact that after several minutes, everything would be over and the soldiers would routinely drag his bloodied corpse into that hole. Watching as they formed a line and waited for their officer, Moguel recalled the entirety of his brief life. He was born in 1890 in the town of Halacho on the Yucatan Peninsula and lived there his entire life, when in 1910, all across the country an uprising broke out against the dictatorship of the president Porfirio Diaz. As a direct result of the revolution, the new body of power was practically immediately split into several groups. A bloody civil war broke out. One of the most famous leaders of the revolutionary movement was Pancho Villa. He experienced huge popularity with the population, but in 1915 suffered a humiliating defeat and was forced to move underground. Throughout Mexico, local armed units sought out his compatriots, and Wenceslao Moguel became one of their casualties of war. In one version of the story, he, like many other Mexicans, avoided military action and did not join either opposing side. Despite war and instability, he tried to make something of himself, and in 1915 became a student at the Yucatan Literary Institute. On the 18th of March, soldiers burst into the academic institution. They entered every building and searched high and low for Moguel. The soldiers led all his friends into the courtyard, along with Moguel himself. In another version, Wenceslao was quite an active revolutionary. He joined forces with Pancho Villa and gathered a group of students to fight together against Mexico's enemies. His regiment, however, was badly equipped and disorganized, so in their first serious battle, the government's forces took Moguel and his comrades into captivity. The Civil War in Mexico stood out for the extreme cruelty displayed by both sides. They staged a fake trial for their captives, and in the space of all but half an hour, an officer had carried out the verdict: the death penalty. In those times, the most widespread method of execution was death by firing squad. A platoon of 8 soldiers shot point blank at a prisoner. Then the officer delivered a fatal blow to the head, confirming that the execution had been carried out successfully. They led Moguel together with other students to the outskirts of the town of Santiago Tequila. There, in the wilderness, they let those sentenced to death smoke one last cigarette. Then, one after another, they were led to a freshly dug hole. Moguel was the last to go. He watched the soldiers methodically shoot his comrades and in his head bid farewell to his life. Then it was his turn. The officer shoved him in the back, pushing him towards the hole. The firing squad had lined up opposite him. The 8 soldiers simultaneously raised their weapons, aiming right for Moguel's head. Closing his eyes, Moguel recited a prayer, unable to face his executioners. He never saw the officer drop his hand, nor did he see all the soldiers pull their triggers at once. A thundering volley of shots hurled Moguel to the ground. His head and chest had become a bloody mush, so when the officer approached the body, he was sure that the man had died instantly. Without paying too much attention to him, he dealt a coup de grace to his head. Satisfied, he ordered the soldiers to throw the executed man into the hole and then assemble. But the incredible had occurred. The executed man had not died. The bullets fired from the soldiers, by some miracle, hadn't damaged any vital organs in the body. After he fell to the ground, Moguel discovered he was still alive. Lying down with his eyes closed, the man heard the officer approach. He decided to hold his breath and play dead. The officer fired his weapon. The bullet hit him in the right side of his skull, but Wencelow had practically lost consciousness and felt nothing at all. They hadn't thrown him into the hole because the regiment had unexpectedly been called upon to perform another urgent task. Just as the sound of the soldier's footsteps faded, Mogel attempted to get to his feet and, with some effort, managed to do it. The man set off to find help. He passed 3 districts and met no one on the streets. Fortunately for Mogel, at the time, the Church of St. James was making preparations for its service and its doors were opened. Now on his last legs, the man entered the church and collapsed. The priest who saw him was deprived of his speech upon seeing this wretched spectacle. The bloodied man laid on the threshold of the church, and his face was so deformed that he could only pronounce inarticulate sounds. However, in his memoirs, Mogel may have slightly exaggerated reality. Several sources confirm that on the following day, he was found unconscious with everyone else who had been executed and was carried to the church, where he received medical help. One way or another, Mogel ended up in the church. One of the parishioners removed the bullets from his body and tended to his wounds. A local sheltered Wencelow until he had recovered. Then the hero of our tale passed through a difficult period in his life, living as an outlaw. He was forced to hide from the authorities until 1924 itself, when the Mexican Revolution had come to its end, and he no longer had to fear for his life. From a medical point of view, no one should survive even one bullet entering their head, since it could potentially cause irreparable damage to the brain. There are, however, several known cases where people received 2 shots to the head and managed to survive. But the majority of vital functions were lost, and those wounded were mostly bedridden. Mogel, though, endured 9 shots and didn't even suffer any serious injuries, with the exception of a fractured skull and deformed face. When doctors first observed him following his execution, they couldn't believe their eyes. So lucky were the bullets' trajectories. Wencelow didn't lose his ability to think and speak. Soon after he again became a fully functioning member of society, the man settled down in the town of Merida, got married, and had 3 children. But he had to feed his family somehow. By that time, he was already known as El Fusilado in his hometown, which means the executed one in Spanish. All over the country, citizens believed him to be a person who would never surrender and overcame death itself. The family's financial status, however, remained pitiable. Mexico's economy was in a decline, and in 1930, in search of a better life, Wencelow emigrated to the U.S., where he made ends meet with odd jobs. Mogel knew no one in the U.S., but people would constantly ask what happened to his face. Wencelow told the story of his miraculous escape, and gradually rumors of the man surviving an execution spread throughout the country. In 1933, a Yucatan academic called Santaj Mendez Espadas published Mogel's biography, written in his words. The book, titled The Miracle of Alacho's Saint, or The Story of an Executed Man, became a real bestseller. Popular publications of the time listed incredible happenings that had occurred since 1600, and everywhere Mogel's execution ranked first. By that time, the hero himself, suspecting nothing, had returned to his family in Merida. In the summer of 1937, breathtaking news came to the sleepy Mexican town. El Fusilado had been invited to New York, where he was to perform in the most popular radio show of the time, Ripley's Believe It or Not. Ripley was so interested in his guest that he sent his family $150 to support them while the breadwinner was absent. At that time, this was no paltry sum. A month's rent, for instance, cost about $26. In terms of money in 2021, Mogel's fee would be equal to almost $300,000. On the 10th of July, Mogel flew out of Mexico and landed in Havana. In the airport, while waiting for his flight to Miami, he gave an interview to the Cuban press, where he talked in detail about his life and miraculous escape. By the time he had arrived in New York, Wencelow was already being talked about in the news, and his performance on the radio show had been heard across the country. Simple and charming Mogel was so well liked by his audience that a tour across the U.S. was organized for him. El Fusilado took part in something called Ripley's Auditorium. Exhibitions where collections of people with fantastic life stories were put on show. They had all previously participated in the radio show and had gained the audience popularity. Similar exhibitions were shown in Cleveland and Dallas, where people formed queues to see the executed man and his terrifying scars. The former Mexican student became a true celebrity. People saw a hero in him. But it's unlikely Moguel was happy about this, since for a brief time, he was an exhibit in a collection of curiosities. On the 9th of August 1937, Moguel returned to his hometown. In his travel bags were memoirs he had written during his travels. El Fusilado had turned into a national celebrity. Every day his neighbors would greet him with joy. But the hero himself didn't share everyone else's joy. By that time, he had grown tired of the attention. He completely refused to reply to the sacks of letters that were delivered to him and dedicated himself to petty trading. With time, the glory of El Fusilado faded. A couple of times, Moguel accidentally appeared in photographs from sports events, but for almost 30 years, no news was heard. Until in 1967, a second edition of The Story of an Executed Man was released. It's worth noting that, while the first edition was decorated with pictures from his youth, on the second edition's cover, the old man who had survived his own execution looked at the reader. The remnants of our hero's life were wrapped up in secret. Several sources verify that El Fusilado himself sold copies of the book in the town center and told his life story to all those who wanted to know. On his death certificate, his career was designated as Tremedator, that is, a person who fulfills various jobs, orders, and tasks for strangers and friends. Despite his serious injuries and life full of hardship, Wenceslao Moguel Herrera lived till he was 85 years. In 1975, the hero of this video died of natural causes in Merida, in the company of his family. One could call it fate, luck, or divine intervention, but Moguel managed to cheat death. The man remained disfigured, but all the same led a worthwhile life. Even after so many years, his story still makes an impression. Do you know of any similar examples of unbelievable escape? Write your breathtaking stories in the comments below. If you liked this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss any notifications about our new releases.